You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Hello? Is that the famous astronomer, Sir Patrick Moore?
It is, very much so.
Any news on the space front?
Quite so. Elon Musk has just designed and developed 5 gigantic, state-of-the-art rocket ships. All members of Parliament, along with the American Senate, have first-class tickets aboard them, you see. They're told they're going to the moon.
Told? Where exactly are they going, Sir Patrick?
The new anomaly discovered recently astronomically. A huge black hole.
Welcome to Twin Souls. Twin Souls is brought to you in association with the Paranormal UK Radio Network, your hosts Philip and Ronald Kinsella. Now, today we've got an amazing guest, and he really needs no introduction. His name is Neil Geddes-Ward. He's an author and an amazing artist, a researcher and explorer into not only the paranormal and UFO phenomena, but other areas that interest the inquiring mind. And Neil is here today to talk about a new book that he's working on that does involve elements of the spirit world, spirit communication, mediums, and such like. So, hello, Neil. How are you?
Hello, Philip, and hello, Ronnie. Well, it's great to be back on your show again, because I was on your show maybe a year or two ago. Had a great time then. So it's nice to come back and update listeners with what I've been doing. So, yeah, it's great. Despite this, the troubles the world's having, we've all got to try and be positive, and, we still got to share our interesting stories and try and carry on.
Yes, and, one of the things that we've all been doing is sharing ideas, normally on a weekly basis. And what's interesting, and I think our listeners will be of great interest, is how, first of all, you became involved in elements of the paranormal, because I know you've got a deep interest in life after death, and subsequent to that, your research. But you started out, first of all, as an artist, but you've always had paranormal experiences, or some elements of them, haven't you, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, artwork is one of those things that's a natural thing for me. I was never any good at sports at school. I subsequently did train to become a musician. I say train, self-taught. I did have lessons as well. But artwork has been one of those natural flares to me that I kind of just absolutely took to it like a duck to water, as they say. And the more I did, the better I became at it. However, I also had a sense of mystery about this place, the world, or whatever. I grew up like you guys did on everything science fiction. I mean, I also loved the horror movies of yesteryear. I mean, I try and stay up late and watch Hammer horror films with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, the old Dracula stuff. Yes. But I was also very curious about ghosts and things. And any books that I had at school from the library, if it had ghost in the title, I would grab it off the bookshelf, because I was just fascinated with the whole subject of spirits and ghosts and things like that. And I remember asking my mum, I think I've perhaps told this particular story before, I remember asking my mum when I was younger, where was I before I was born? And she said, well, you didn't exist. And I said, well, I must have existed. And that kind of launched this kind of curiosity within me to go further and try and find out, well, if I didn't exist, or maybe I thought I did, well, where was I? I didn't have obviously answers at that point, and maybe I still haven't really, but it kind of opened up a whole kind of field of interest. And if there was anything weird on the TV, I wanted to watch it. So whether it was the late Doris Stokes appearing on one of these programs talking about mediumship, I was fascinated with that. or it might have been in the early 1980s, the Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World program. Going back before that, there used to be a program, I think it was during the school holidays, I think, and it was with the old guy that used to be on Mastermind, Magnus Magnusson, but he presented this thing on sort of Scottish mysteries or something like that, about the Loch Ness Monster and ghosts and hauntings and things, which I absolutely found fascinating as well. So really, it's a whole potpourri of different things kind of got my interest, and I've kind of forged ahead ever since, really.
Yes, I'm just thinking back to that time, as you were saying, when we were kids, but we're more or less in the same age bracket, aren't we, Neil? It's the fact that the subject was rather taboo. Even back then, I mean, you mentioned Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World. We used to watch that as well, but he always ended it on a note, but is it true? You know, he'd blow up this beautiful balloon and then stick a pin in it afterwards.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it was a good show, and I found that really they did a fairly good balance of things. Really, I mean, they did cover lots of spooky stories, which I found to be absolutely fascinating. But although it was labelled as his show, I kind of got the impression that really he wasn't the guy that went out and did the research and interviewed the witnesses or anything like that. He was the guy that just provided the links or the introduction and the ending of the stuff. And he was probably paid a large sum of money just to introduce it. So he lent his name to the project, so to speak. But I don't think, you know, looking back, he probably didn't really take much of a great interest in the whole thing.
No, but he was a wonderful science fiction writer. I mean, as you said about being science fiction as well, which we're both into as well, his Childhood's End book, which I've read numerous times, I thought that was wonderful. So, yes, it's ironic, isn't it? He's a science fiction writer and he's a scientist.
Yes, that's right. I mean, he wrote. I mean, I'm never a great novel reader, but I know he did write some great novels and things like that, and he had a great imagination. And I do recall one of the episodes where he did speak about the fact that they had people. I think they were channeling spirits, doing artwork, perhaps, or they might have been doing writing, and some of the people questioned whether it was really true that, you know, these people were channeling spirits that were doing artwork, because they wondered if it was actually the quality should have been better. So Arthur C. Clarke, he said, as a writer, I'm not prepared to accept the fact that our kind of ability diminishes when you get beyond the grave. And so I think he wrote that whole thing off based upon just a few mediums or channelers or whoever he saw. Whereas I believe it's one of these things you have to keep looking and looking and looking. And now and again, you find the gold in the river.
Yes, and you seem to have done that, Neil, because you are now working on a book that centres all around mediums, and not just mediums that communicate through what we know as clairvoyance, but also channeled information. And do you want to explain a little bit, Neil, about your book, the book that you're working on?
Yeah, sure. I mean, basically, the genesis for this book started off actually through my artwork, because I would be going around to various conferences when we could have conferences and meet with more than 6 people, whether they're pagan conferences or anything similar. I would go round to them and sell my artwork as prints and things like that at these conferences. And I was aware that they also needed speakers. And because I had a lot of interest in this field, I might say, well, look, I'll do a talk on my artwork for you, which initially I started to do, or I'll do a talk on fairies, ghosts and spirits, because I got an interest in this sort of thing. There's some interesting stories that I could tell you. So basically I started to do these talks at these various events, and that way I would get a free stall to sell my artwork. So it was a bit of a trade-off, you see. Now, of course, after each sort of speech or talk that I'd given at these places, various people would then come up to me and then relate their particular story. They'd always say, oh, you might want to know about this or something. Some of the stories were average, but now and again you get some absolutely gems of interesting stories. So I'd always remember those ones and thought, well, this is going to add to my next kind of collection when I go around again. You know, I'll be telling that story next time around. So it built upon that gradually over the years. And it got to such a point where I thought, well, actually, I could probably put this down in a book. So At the beginning of the lockdown, I'd already kind of drafted out a rough chapter anyway, maybe a year before. But at the beginning of lockdown, I thought, right, I'm going to do this now. So I started off, and it's called Encounters with Fairies, Ghosts and Spirits. And I cover a lot of fairy encounters because back in about 2004, I co-wrote a book called Fairycraft. And a lot of my early research with the fairy world came from that research. So I've incorporated some of those stories and brought them up to date a little bit for this book, and again I've thrown in some spiritual encounters and ghostly encounters, and I kind of look at the whole thing. You know, what are spirits? Are they the same as ghosts? Or and then what is beyond? What's the communication like with these spirits? Because remember, it is encounters with them, so it's not necessarily just seeing a ghost or a spirit come through the wall at you or something. It's actually looking at all the possibilities of how we can encounter them, and that includes mediums who are actually making an effort to communicate with these spirits. And so I go into the whole thing where I look at different mediums. I also cover the bad mediums, the ones that are fake, because obviously I've met them all. Well, I say I met them all. There's some ones I really want to meet, you know, that I've heard of, some that I'd love to meet, but there's some that I don't want to see again.
Yes, yeah. And, you know, for our listeners, Neil also co-hosts the Paranormal Radio Peep Show. And of course, you deal with a lot of guests that have their experiences. But one of the interesting things about your book and many of the sections that you cover, let's talk about ghosts, because you've done a lot of research on Harry Martingale and his sighting of the Roman ghosts of York. And I think, you know, would you be able to give us a little bit of or the listeners a bit of a taster on what that's all about?
Yeah, sure. Well, I actually first heard this story many years ago as a child. I think I used to watch Nationwide, which was a BBC TV program. It used to come on about 6 o'clock. And they sometimes covered ghostly stories for whatever reason. And they covered this particular story, which I found fascinating. And I kind of remembered it when I started to write this book. And I thought, oh, yeah, there was that guy that was in York and he saw Romans or something in a basement. So, of course, I went on to Google and tracked down the information. I actually watched a few videos as well. And what it was in February 1953 in the northern English town of York. And Harry Martindale was a young apprentice plumber who was only about 18 at the time. And he was enlisted with a team of other plumbers and heating installers to work on behalf of the National Trust to install new heating at this place called the Treasurer's House, which was actually at the time a Grade 1 listed building. And so basically he was tasked with putting pipes and drilling holes in the basement of this large house. Now, in the basement where he'd been working, some archaeologists had actually dug away at the ground and found what they believed to be part of a Roman road there, because you know the maps showed that a Roman road ran through that part of the building. Although it was an old building, of course it wasn't as old as the Romans, you see. So they had built over this Roman road in sort of like the 1700s or something with this old large house, the Treasurer's House. So Harry Martindale, being a young apprentice plumber and not knowing a thing, he saw this, what he thought was a ditch, and thought, oh, I'll put my ladder in there because it'll support my ladder as I climb up at it. So then I can start drilling through the wall and pulling my pipes through and things. So he spent about 5 hours, you know, drilling and pulling pipes through, spending a lot of time, and he's there by himself. And after about the 5th hour, he's pretty tired. It was towards the end of the day, and he heard this strange noise, and it sounded like the sort of a sound of a one note, and he thought it was like a weird, strange song on the radio. He thought, what's that tune on the radio? It's just playing one note, and it sounded like a weird horn playing. But it got louder and louder and louder, and eventually he said, where just below his ladder, he suddenly saw this Roman soldier walk out of the wall below him, and he was so shocked that he actually fell backwards off his ladder and scrambled into the corner of the room and hid there, absolutely frightened out of his wits. And then after this Roman soldier had come through the wall, another Roman soldier appeared, but this one was actually on top of a horse. Now, the interesting thing was he said that he could see them from the knees upwards, but he couldn't see the bottoms of their legs. But it's only when they got to this excavated Roman road did their legs fully appear. Now, the interesting thing about these Romans, and there was not just two of them, there was probably about 12 to 15 of these people coming through, is that they were wearing green tunics. Now, Romans are traditionally thought of as wearing red tunics with long rectangular shields, but he said these ones, and he kept his guns on this. He said no, these Romans, they had green tunics and they had round shields, and they didn't have long knives. They had small daggers sort of attached to holsters. And he said that he could even see where they hadn't shaved for a few days and they were splattered with mud as if they had been walking somewhere in the wet. And he said that the sound of that horn that he heard initially, he finally saw this person come in blowing on a great big horn of some sort, and that was the last person to come through the wall. But basically a whole troop of Romans came through this wall, and although he was frightened, they did not look at him at all. They didn't look down at him. They just marched straight ahead and vanished into the other side of the wall. And he was so frightened out of his wits, he ran up the stairs and he encountered a guy that was a caretaker of the building there. And the caretaker of the building could tell by the look on his face he was obviously shocked, and he said to him, "Oh, you must have seen the Romans, my lad." So it's obviously that this caretaker was aware of the existence of these Romans down in the basement, and a few people were, but Harry Martindale wasn't. But he was so frightened that he never went back to work at this building, and basically he lost his job as an apprentice plumber. He says, "I'm just not going back there." And he told his friends about it. He said, "Don't tell anyone about it." But of course, they started to speak about it, and the word got out. And many years later, of course, when they were tracking down the story and they was re-listening to his account of what had actually happened, and they listened to the fact that he described these Romans of having mud-splattered uniforms, and they were green tunics. Someone very clever into his history analysed that, and they said that those particular Romans were what they call an auxiliary branch of the Roman Empire. So in other words, when the main Romans left Britain and went back to Italy, they left these pockets of, if you like, almost like the territorial army of today. They left these local Romans, which were probably made up of the populace of Britain, and they were employed to be their stand-in Romans to keep an eye on everything. And so they wore a lesser uniform of green with small round shields and small daggers, rather than the traditional red tunics with the large shields. And Harry Martindale wouldn't have known that, which I thought was a really interesting point.
Yeah, and that's really fascinating. I mean, I know you've spent a lot of time and energy researching that for your new book. So what's your idea, Neil, about this encounter? I mean, most people would say that it's ghostly apparitions, but why do you think it happens? Do you think it's some type of tape recording that's caught that happens every so often? Or do you think it's an overlap of timelines that are still occurring their time to ours that's crossed over? What's your understanding of that?
Well, you talked about a recording. Now, there's something called the stone tape theory, where they suggest that maybe people are perceiving actions of the past that have somehow been recorded into the atmosphere or the environment, maybe in old buildings, and maybe a psychic person might then somehow trigger off that sight and see them. Now, I quite accept that's a possibility, but when I actually looked further into this Roman encounter with Harry Martindale, about 7 or 8 years later, the building was under the care of another lady who was then the caretaker. I forget her name now, but she had 2 small dogs, and it was her job to go around the building at the end and check all the doors and things like that. Now, her dogs were aware of something in that very same basement, and they were barking down there. Now, this would have been about 1957, 1958. And I think that would have been about October or November. Harry Martindale's was in the February of 1953, so it was the winter months. Now, this lady was seeing hers in the winter months just prior to Christmas of 1957. And again, she saw the same Roman soldiers coming through that wall. But this time, she said they were leading a whole troop of horses. It just wasn't one horse. And they were again splattered with mud. And then she saw them about 2 months later. So that would have probably been about November, going on into December. And this time she said she saw all the horses coming through the wall. And this time the Romans were all laying across their horses as if they were totally whacked out, knackered, asleep, but sleeping on their horses, and their horses were literally taking them back to camp. And again, they were splattered with mud. So although the stone tape theory suggests maybe that people are viewing the past in some way, what they were seeing suggests to me they're seeing different actions. So it wasn't just one recording being played, but many different scenes, but still perhaps of the same characters or of at least the same legion of Romans. But the interesting thing is that each witness, Harry Martindale and this lady 7 years later, witnessed that they were splattered with mud, which I suggest that may be that they were being viewed in their own time frame of their own winter. So Harry Martindale had seen his in, say, the February of 1953. It would have been cold and wet, presumably in 1953. Now, I did a little bit of research, and I found that when Romans were in Britain about 2,000 years ago, the weather was actually particularly warm, so much so that you could actually grow grapes in places like York. So obviously, if it's very warm and you could grow grapes in York, and these Romans are being sighted with mud on them, it would suggest to me that it's a very, very wet winter that they've been sighted in rather than the summertime, you see. So I'm suggesting that maybe they were being seen in sort of the simultaneous month of maybe February of 2,000 years ago, and Harry Martindale saw his in February of 1953, and then the lady 7 years later in 1957, or whenever it was, saw hers in October and November, and again they were splattered in mud. She's citing them in October and November. Maybe it was their October and November of, again, 2,000 years ago. So they're almost like peering through a window of time, simultaneous time. All these events happen at once. So rather than it's an action that's being replayed, they're seeing them actually happening through some kind of other reality portal, if you like. I don't know.
The stone recording, actually, I like that because it opens up another paradox that what they're seeing is not a recording at all, as you've just very cleverly suggested, Neil. So that rules that out. So that's fascinating, isn't it? Fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I can't theory. It's just little things I've seen and little things that kind of thought, I wonder this, I wonder that. Now, obviously, I've got an awareness of theories of simultaneous time. So therefore, then I've kind of thought, well, maybe that's an indication of simultaneous time. So it's possible. I mean, it could be just that they could all be dead ghosts and they're haunting the place, but they don't seem to be interacting with anybody. And the other interesting thing is that their legs only became visible once they reached that point where the road was now visible. And I actually wonder, again, if Harry Martindale wasn't down in that cellar or that lady wasn't looking in the cellar with her dogs, are those Romans continually walking backwards and forwards, but they're not being seen by anybody? And it's only the fact that they made a cellar by digging down into that road did the Romans become visible. So does that mean then that when we're walking around on our normal everyday present roads of 21st century England or Scotland or wherever we may live, that there's Romans walking under us all the time? We're completely aware of them.
No, I think they were meant to see it. And also, if it is a timeline, some kind of a crossing of times, that would open up another paradox of time travel. But yes, absolutely, Neil, I agree with you completely. That's I think the individuals were meant to see them. I don't believe they would have just walked through unseen. I think it's something to do with the individual, some psychic connection or something, perhaps. I think it would be interesting also to know if the place is still around. Do you know if the building itself is still around, Neil?
Yeah, I believe it is. I saw a few YouTube videos on it, and they were only maybe a few years old. And this place is in York, and they do tours of it. And you can go, or well, you used to be able to go down into the cellar before COVID-19, and this guy would show you around, and he would tell you the story and things like that. So yeah, it's one of their kind of big attractions is the Harry Martindale story. I mean, York is predominantly known for its connection with the Vikings, in fact. But so it's nice to actually hear a Roman story coming from there. I mean, you might get ghosts of Vikings kicking about here and there, but it's nice to have the old Romans paying us a visit now and again.
You know, I think it's interesting because your book that you're working on, do you have a title for the book yet, Neil?
Yep, it's called Encounters with Fairies, Ghosts and Spirits.
Wonderful. And I know that the book is filled, it's going to be littered with a lot of very interesting cases. And another case that I know that people will be fascinated by, and this is something I really wanted to talk to you about, was the language expert who encountered the ancient Chinese spirit and who speaks in ancient Chinese long forgotten that only he can understand. So this really fascinated me because you tell the story, Neil, because I think the listeners will absolutely love this.
Yeah, well, this is a bit of a complex one, and I mean, not that I know much about Chinese at all, but what it was is that obviously there's people that believe in this sort of stuff, and there's people that are skeptics, and this actually was a guy that was totally skeptical against anything paranormal, but he had this experience in the 1920s. I forget the year, but basically he was a language expert that could speak up to 30 different languages.
Wow.
I forget the guy's name. I'm going to try and see if I can find it here in my notes. But basically, yeah, he could speak 30 different languages fluently and understand them. But one of his specialities was ancient Chinese, in the same way that we might have heard of ancient Old English. We don't speak Old English today. And in the same way in China, they don't speak ancient Chinese. They speak mostly Mandarin, which is a more modern Chinese language. So this guy, he came from England, but he was out in America, in New York, and he knew a judge out there he respected this judge's opinion. And he said, look, I want you to come to this seance with your language skills. I want you to give an opinion on what's going on here, type of thing. So he went to this seance, and it was with this very famous medium at the time. And again, I will try and get the name once I come across his name in my notes, but I can't think of it offhand.
Oh.
But it wasn't him. No, this is an American medium. Leslie Flint was the right, I think I'm coming across it actually. Yeah, Leslie Flint was the English medium, which we can cover in a minute. But this guy basically had a seance, and the English guy who could speak various languages was invited to go there by this judge, an American judge. And as he sat there, he said he saw this cone, a seance cone, which is what mediums use in their seances, where voices are alleged to manifest from. And basically, the medium was this guy called Valentine, and the guy who was George Valentine was the medium. That's right, and it was Mr. William Cannon who was the guy that was visiting. The judge was Mr. William Cannon. Sorry, beg your pardon. This Valentine was reported to have at least 14 languages coming through this seance cone at any one time. So this guy Wyman, who was the English guy that could speak 30 languages, he said that he saw the trumpet rise off the floor and float towards him, and he could hear the very faint voice of his own deceased father-in-law speaking to him in his English West Country accent. Now, remember, this is in New York. So he thought, how on earth would these people in this seance room, these New Yorkers, would know that I've got a father-in-law who's dead that also spoke in a West Country accent, maybe of like Somerset or Devonshire or whatever. And they would not understand the local dialect of a West Country accent of England, you see. So he thought that was quite impressive. But he said then came another voice to Wyman, but this time, as I said earlier, it was in an ancient Chinese tongue that only himself could recognize. He could only understand this. Nobody else would understood Chinese, let alone this ancient Chinese tongue. And he said it was so ancient that he couldn't actually speak it very well. He said he could understand some of it as being said, but he couldn't actually speak it fluently back. So he could only respond in a more modern version of Chinese, like Mandarin. So he said, if this was a hoax, it was a particularly clever one, far beyond the scope of any of the sinologues now living. He said, the voice said, my mean name is Kyung, men call me Fu Chi, and my lowly style is Ki. Now, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. But he says, basically, this was the name by which Confucius, i.e. Confucius say, all that kind of stuff, ancient Confucius, the Chinese scholar, whatever, was canonized by. So he asked him to repeat his name, and the name came back again. He says, my name is Kyung Fu Chi, or something like that. I might be pronouncing it wrong. But he said he knew that as Confucius. He said, now I thought was my opportunity. He says, Chinese, I had long regarded as my own special research area, and he would be a wise man, medium or other, who would attempt to trick me on such soil. He says, if this tremendous voice were that of the old ethicist who had personally edited the Chinese classics, then I had an abundance of questions to ask him. Then it burst upon me that I was listening to a Chinese of purity and delicacy not now spoken in any part of China. So basically, this Confucius would go on and he would recite all the poems he had written like 2,000 years ago or something. And this guy would sort of like start the poem, and this voice would finish off the poem for him. And he said that how on earth could that be fate? Because A, it's speaking an ancient Chinese language, it's reciting poems that only this guy would know about, and it's going through the whole of the 14 verses of the poems and things. And so he ruled out the fact that this guy, the medium, was faking it, because he says there's no way he could have ever have known any of this. And obviously sometimes when you could hear these dialects, and this guy went for another 12 or 13 sit-ins to this seance later on, where again he used some of his other languages to speak to people coming through there, and he heard Portuguese, Spanish, Russian, Jewish dialects and things like that. And while these voices were coming through in their various languages, he said he could hear the medium himself speaking. So he said he knew it wasn't the medium speaking because he could hear him talking anyway. So somehow these voices were manifesting through this seance trumpet, all these different languages, which was an absolutely gobsmacking piece of information to come through, really. And he said that this guy that was doing this, he was an absolute skeptic at first. And so he used to relate these stories to people. And he said the only reason he decided to write it down in a book was because he got fed up telling the same story. He wasn't there to make money. He had enough money anyway, but he decided to write down a book so he could just hand the book out to people and say, here, read my book. It saves me having to keep repeating the story for you. And that was about 1927. It's a long forgotten story, that one.
Wow, that's incredible. And it also goes to prove our understanding of what we call the spirit world, or the other side, where our personalities, our consciousness survives the state we call death. And I think that as instruments which you've been exploring, or mediators, mediums, channels, are able on some levels, the genuine ones, to connect with these other personalities that were alive a few years ago, some even thousands of years ago. So I know that, your research has led you also into the channeling side. And I know that one of your big subject matters was Leslie Flint, wasn't it? You looked into his work as well.
Yeah, that's right. Now, Leslie Flint was a similar medium to the guy in New York we just mentioned. He was a direct voice medium, except he didn't have a cone that levitated. He produced, or the spirits quite correctly, produced what they call an ectoplasmic voice box, which floated in the room. And through that voice box, different voices could be made manifest. Now, I've been speaking to a guy called Leo Bonomo, and I met Leo about 8 or 9 years ago at a demonstration of transfiguration. That's where a face of a spirit will allegedly appear over the face of the medium, and you should be able to recognize the face of the departed over their face. But unfortunately, we didn't see anything. But anyway, me and Leo struck up a friendship, and we've kind of like had little chats now and again. We've even interviewed him on our Paranormal Peep show. And he was very fortunate that he could actually go. He was invited to see Leslie Flint towards the last years of his life in 1990. So he said he went and saw Leslie Flint, and they went into this room. And he said that, he could hear Leslie talking, but at the same time, he heard this voice of this man, Dr. Clarkson, I think he said he was. He appeared to be a doctor. He said that the voice appeared above him in the ceiling somewhere, and it would move across the room backwards and forwards. And he said, clairvoyantly, in his mind's eye, Leo could see this man pacing up and down the room with his hands behind his back, who he took to be this Dr. Clarkson. And this Dr. Clarkson would be talking about treatments and cures and things, and he even spoke about a cure for cancer, I understand. So he had a really great experience with him. Now, Leslie Flint brought through loads of people, like something like 3,000 or 4,000 personalities came through Leslie Flint of different voices. Now, I was saying this to Leo recently. I said, if you go to the Wikipedia pages of Leslie Flint, you'll find it's completely negative. They just talk about, oh, he's a fake and this, that, and the other. They don't speak about any of the positive things where people have actually had some great results from it. They just don't put any of that down. I mean, although he demonstrated in the dark, I understand, he actually also demonstrated at a place called Kingsway Hall in London, which I've been to many years ago. And it was an absolutely packed house. And he had his seance cabinet, which is like a large box-like structure on the stage, where he would sit in there, and they put microphones, about 3 microphones were placed inside this seance cabinet with Leslie Flint inside. And they had one of the sound technicians who was setting up this. So the idea is that you could hear these voices being amplified around the room, coming through the speakers so that the audience could hear it. And one of the test technicians, the audio technician, sat inside the seance cabinet and shouted as loud as he could. But the microphones weren't picking him up very well. I mean, remember, this is the 1940s, and microphones weren't as sensitive perhaps as they are today, and they could hardly be heard. And yet when Leslie Flint started producing the phenomenon, Mickey, Leslie Flint's guide, came through, he could be absolutely heard loud and clear above everything. And all these people's relatives were being brought forth. It wasn't just kind of like celebrity personalities, although 1 or 2 did come through. I understand an actress at the time came through who died. Various people, relatives and friends had come through that night. And towards the end of the evening, there was a bit of a stir because Mickey announced, he said, oh, I've got some rather sad news. We got a voice here of a gentleman who's a policeman that was murdered last night in that area. And he literally came through the seance of Leslie Flint, literally the very next night. And he was asking for his sister Florrie, who he said is up in the top tier of the audience. And she answered, she goes, yes, I'm here. And this policeman who had been murdered basically went on to say that the killer lived in a small bedsit and he's got the gun hidden under his mattress or something. I don't know if they ever caught the killer. I think they possibly did, actually. But again, that's not mentioned on things like Wikipedia, who don't like to talk about the positive successes of that. No. I know that skeptics would challenge that, but, you know, that's the nature of skeptics, isn't it?
Wikipedia is a terrible platform to use when actually investigating anything paranormal. I mean, from UFOs to fairies to ghosts, they will poo-poo everything. But I guess we're not surprised, Neil. The powers that be, as we assume or know, they don't want people, evidently, they don't want people to know any of this stuff. You know, it's just a nonsense on Wikipedia, and it does annoy me. You know, I've mentioned this in a book that they're asking for sponsors to support them, which is fair enough. But I don't agree with what they're doing because the Pascagoula event on there, a UFO encounter, if people look at that, they'll see the absolute travesty they've caused in referring to it basically as very elusive. So yes, I agree with you about Wikipedia, but fascinating about this medium, very fascinating, Neil.
Yeah, I mean, interesting on the Wikipedia side, although you're allowed to go back and edit it, if they don't like it, they'll soon change what you've done. Yes. It was done that with the Star Child skull. The guy that did the Star Child skull, he would try and write out his own notes for it, and within a few days it would be changed back or it'd be deleted and things like that. And he actually spoke to Wikipedia, says, look, Khan, let's speak on an even playing field here. I'll tell you my facts, and you can tell me your facts. He says, I'm the guy that's been looking into this, whereas you haven't. And they would just completely edit out his take and his side of things. Now, I find it interesting that when you got these skeptics, they always want at least 5 scientists to verify your research or your experience or whatever it is. They won't listen to you until you've got 5 scientists who will absolutely say, yes, we all agree that's absolutely what happened. And yet, if you've got a person with a UFO encounter and the Men in Black or the military or the secret agencies come out to you, they don't ask for 5 scientists to verify your UFO encounter. They just say, keep your trap shut and don't talk.
That's
Don't
right.
they?
I'd say, Neil, the thing is, though, we do know, as with anything related with any area of research, in this case, paranormal stroke UFO, but your book is about the other side and about mediums, gifted mediums, and also those who are not so gifted, because you've also explored certain territories where charlatans are brought forward. And I think that's very important, because your book gives a wonderful balance so that the reader is able to see that, that there are those situations where some mediums aren't as good as others, and those who are fakes and those that are genuine. So I think that's very important, that you've given that balance for people to see that there is evidence that you have the good and the bad and the ugly, as they say.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, during my research over many years, I mean, I've seen some very, very good mediums, including your good self, Philip. But I've also seen some bad ones. I've had some bad personal readings, just me and a medium in a room, very, very bad readings. And then I've seen some excellent ones. But with the side of things that really disappoints me is the physical, what they call physical mediumship. So for people that need to know this, there's what's called mental mediumship, or clairvoyance as it's commonly termed, which is what you yourself do, Philip, where
Yes.
you receive impressions from the spirit, and you have to translate that and give that out to a person. So you might see a vision, a picture, an image, a feeling, a thought, and you then retranslate that out to the recipient. On the physical side of things, is where the spirits can raise enough energy to actually move things about the room, or manifest something like, in extreme cases where you need a lot of energy in a very special medium, a physical person might step out of a seance cabinet, or they might speak in trance or something to a lesser degree. And that has always been the area where the most fakery of these things occurs, because most of this kind of stuff is done in the dark. They claim it's because the spirit manifestations are sensitive to the light, in the same way that our old film used to be sensitive to the light. You'd have to develop it in a dark room with infrared lights as your aid. And in any seances, they again use infrared lights, so you can see something. But normally, most of it would be done in the dark. There will be people that will take advantage of that kind of procedure. And I've seen people that will, produce funny voices that are absolutely diabolical.
Yes.
They'll have people singing along to their old tunes that they had when they were out, like Louis Armstrong, can't sing in time with the song that he wrote, "Oh, It's a Wonderful World." He can't sing in time with it. That was a guy called Chris from the north of England. I can't remember his surname. Lucky for him, I can't remember. And and then, of course, he brought through later on the famous flamboyant, the 20th century, the writer that we all know as Quentin Crisp, but he got the name wrong, and it says, "Hello, everybody, it's Quentin Crispin here." So I thought, well, hang on, if you're Quentin Crispin, sure you could get your name right, It was really, really, really bad. I mean, he couldn't even fake it bad. He was so bad. And I remember sitting next to this lady, because they placed everybody in seats so you couldn't know anybody. And I just sat next to this lady. I said, "Have you been to anything like this before?" She goes, "No, I've never seen anything like this." So I said, "Oh, okay." So as the evening proceeded on, I found myself putting my head in my hands thinking, this is diabolically embarrassing. And at the end of it, when the lights finally went up, I said, "So what did you think of it then?" She goes, "I thought it was bloody awful." I said, "I couldn't agree with you more."
As you know, and I know that, my mediumship is something I never wanted, but I think and believe was inherent. And exploring consciousness and dealing with facts and only presenting that evidence as it comes through with a yes or a no and never feeding. I've been interested in channeled material, but never been able to channel myself in terms of like writing or bringing discarnate voices through. I suppose there are some individuals who are very gifted with that. We spoke about that because you helped me with a lot of research, Neil, with both books, with Guardians of the Dead, and you did your artwork is on there of the spiritual book Guardians of the Dead that just came out, and also you, the public, to see, because we spoke in length about Jane Roberts, the American medium. which you helped me try and source information about or help steer me in the right direction. And I believe that she was completely genuine with her Seth material. But you've also examined some of the British greats like Gordon Higginson, haven't you, Neil, as well?
Yeah. Now, Gordon Higginson, he was like the golden boy of mediumship. I mean, there was a few other people that I haven't actually had the fortune to see. Scottish mediums like Gordon Best, I think is not Gordon Best, Albert Best. Yeah, there's Albert Best, who is allegedly a really good medium, and I'd like to find out more about him. But Gordon Higginson was an English medium, and I was fortunate enough to see him about in 1990 as well. Oddly, the same year that Leo Bonomo saw Leslie Flint, oddly enough. And I was about 22, 23 at the time. And of course, I was absolutely gobsmacked, and I was attending this spiritualist church in Uxbridge in Middlesex, and they said, we're going to be having Gordon Higginson, who is the president of the Spiritualist National Union. I'd never heard of him, but he's really good. And they said he gives out phone numbers and everything. So they said it's don't miss it sort of thing. So, I booked a ticket. I came along there with a friend of mine, and we sat there, and he was doing this reading, and he was amazing, absolutely amazing. I can't remember how long he went on for, maybe an hour and a half or something, but he would go up to people and he'd give out their phone numbers, and there was a guy sitting near the front, and he pointed to him and he says, you, sir, before you came out here tonight, he says, the coat you are wearing is not the coat you originally set out in. He said, you came out in a different coat. You got in your car, and then you decided you didn't like the coat that you were wearing, and you went back into your house. You threw the coat on your bed, and you've now got the coat out of your wardrobe that you're now wearing, and you came here tonight. And my helpers, and by helpers he meant spirit guides, have just gone down to the multi-story car park below us, because we're in a large modern building. They've just gone down to the multi-story car park below us, and they've just seen your car and told me it's a red sports car with the number plate PYE something something something. He said the number plate, and this bloke absolutely sat there gobsmacked, jaw on the floor, couldn't believe. He said, "Yes, I've done exactly everything you've just described," and we all clapped. It was amazing.
Wow.
He was an absolutely incredible medium, but he was doing mental mediumship, but he was also an absolute brilliant, as I understand it. And I wasn't fortunate enough to see him to do this, but I understand it. He also did a lot of physical mediumship, where ectoplasm, which is this mysterious stuff that mediums will produce, come out their body, which can then become solidified forms of spirit.
Sorry, Neil, I just wanted to ask you, because I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think the listeners would be interested. Ectoplasm, does that just form out of nothing, out of their mouths, or is it something they use, like Muslim?
Well, no, it's not Muslim. It's been likened to Muslim or cheesecloth, as some people call it. And in fact, in fake seances, they've actually used that material. But this mysterious stuff called ectoplasm, it seems to be present in everybody. But when, say, we're dead and a doctor or someone does an autopsy, they don't find a little ectoplasm organ that's produced a whole load of it they can put into a jar. It seems to be one of those things that becomes manifest and solid as a result of the seance. It's almost like in us, but we're not aware of it. It's almost like a spiritual stuff, and it only becomes solid and is produced out of us. It's almost like we're saying... it's almost like, and I don't want to say it, I'm using an analogy here. It's almost like as if we breathe air out of us, and then you could breathe air and make it solid into ice or something, like carbon dioxide could be frozen or something. It's almost something like that. But this is a material or substance. I believe there's claims where it has been analyzed, but it kind of disappears after a while. Even if you put it in a jar, it just vanishes. What happens is that this stuff is a temporary stuff that comes out of everybody, not just the medium, but it has been photographed coming out of the medium. It will come out any orifice. It even comes out their eyes, and it will come out and go onto the floor. And in one of the descriptions of Gordon Higginson's demonstration, this particular lady who was sitting near him was invited to touch it. And she said it felt firm and strong in her hand, but also very wrappable. You could wrap it around your hands. It was strong. You could stretch it and things. And then it would disappear and float into the floor, then come up as a solid person. And it would be used as a temporary way of these spirits to move about, almost like a facsimile of their former self. it would be that, you know, you'd see a form of a person, but they were all manifested as ectoplasmic forms. And sometimes, like in the case of Minnie Harris, who was another medium, sometimes she would produce forms as well. And there'd be ladies coming around out of the seance room with large skirts. And one of the people sitting in the seance, I think it might have been Tom Harris, her son, said, "Oh, Auntie so-and-so," because it was apparently a relative of theirs that was manifesting. He says, "I can't see your feet." And she says, "Oh, I haven't got them, dear." And she lifted up her whole dress, and he said he couldn't even see her legs. So they only manifest what they really want to show you. They don't have to manifest everything. You know, it's not necessary. But there's been cases of extraordinary reports of people that have witnessed these manifestations. For instance, the medium Helen Duncan, who was a wartime medium, she was actually put away in prison because she was bringing out information that was upsetting the war ministry at the time. She was actually giving information about ships, British ships that were being sunk. And the war ministry did not want the public to know that these boats were being sunk. And yet here were sailors coming out into a seance room who'd gone down on these ships, declaring that they'd gone down on ships like the HMS Hood. And so a kind of conspiracy was struck where that she would be taken to court. She was charged at the Old Bailey, put in prison for 9 months. That got her out of the way because D-Day was looming and they wanted to sort all that out. And so basically she was put away. But after the war years, people then continued to go and see her. And there was a particular occasion where this Scottish Highland piper, complete with bagpipes and the great big kind of feathery hat they have, came out of the seance room with a pony that kept nodding its head. And these people have testified to seeing that in her seance. Now, she was accused of fakery. She was accused of having 2 stomachs, one where she would eat the cheesecloth and puke it back up again, somehow into the shape of a pony and a Highland piper. I mean, how on earth did you do that?
Neil, did the Highland Room pony actually walk, or were they just like static? Did they actually move?
No, I understood that it came out and the Highland pony from the witness said that it nodded its head up and down as ponies do. So it appeared to be a living, breathing pony, but I presume it was manifested out of the ectoplasm that had come out of the sitters and also out of Helen Duncan at that time. And they can't last forever. They only last for the duration that the energy's there, and then they would dissipate and go back into the medium. That's a very dangerous point, I understand, because if you open, say, the darkened room to light, it will cause this ectoplasm to shrink back and whiplash back into people, and that's where they can get injured. And I understand that happened to Helen Duncan. She was actually injured, and it was that injury that caused her to suffer ill health after that, and eventually she did die some years later.
Yeah, I have seen a manifestation on a few occasions, one of which when I was with a medium, and she actually brought my spirit guide's face over hers, and I did actually see that. It was very bizarre, and as you know, we're black and white, Neil, but it actually she transfigured, or her face transfigured into this North American Indian, and I could see it very clearly because I was quite shocked. I was only in the room with her for about 15 minutes max because she worked very quickly. So I have seen manifestation before. But one of the things I find interesting as well is, you're right, because if the etheric body is stretched and any sound or perhaps light in the case of mediums who actually, you know, manifest the spirits, especially if you're opening to spirit, the etheric body expands, and of course you're in a heightened state of awareness, and any loud intrusive sounds can send that etheric body quickly back into you and cause some damage. And I know that the only time that happened to me was when I was going to perform a service in a church, and I was opening up or getting ready, and of course what happens is your mind and your auric energy expands to accommodate, I believe, the space of those on the other side, and someone slammed a door, and of course I had serious palpitations for a few years that the hospital tried to get down, and I'm sure that was a result of that. So that's I will clarify, that is absolutely true what you said there, also with regards to shock or light. I mean, mine was more to do with the sound than light.
Yeah, that's right. It's a very kind of serious thing. I mean, there's a more modern day medium called David Thompson. He comes from England, but I believe he lives out in Australia. Now, he does alleged manifestations of spirit. He's been doing it for about 20 plus years. And he produces the phenomena similar to Helen Duncan and people like that. And various spirits have been known to come through. I mean, I have heard a recording on a website where you can hear this lady talking to her partner that's died, and he's coming through. Now, this is the interesting thing, because this is what Leo Bonomo said to me. He says that what happens, certainly in the case of Leslie Flynn, is that when they want to talk through this voice box that I mentioned earlier, is that the spirits on their side have to impress their face into a mask-like structure, which I believe is on their side, and that then receives their thoughts. So I imagine, and again, it's an analogy, I'm not saying this is the case, but I imagine it's something like a gas mask or visor or something that fits over the spirit face and somehow amplifies their mind thoughts or their thoughts in some way, which is then transmitted down through to the medium and then comes out through that voice box that's been manifested on this side of life. It's rather like, it's almost like acting as a microphone for the mind, if you like. But when these people wear it on the other side of life, a lot of them might have, say, claustrophobic problems with it or something like that. They don't like it. I mean, Leo said they have trouble breathing, but it makes you think, well, hang on, these are spirits. Do they breathe? You know, do they suffer from claustrophobia? All these little questions come up. You know, you think, well, you know, what should be happening there? Surely that shouldn't be possible on the other side of life, but maybe they do. Oh yeah. This particular spirit was coming through, speaking to his wife at a David Thompson seance, and he was saying, "Oh, I'm a bit nerved out by this. I'm a bit scared of how to do this. This is so strange." And you can hear the sitters in the sound saying, no, come on, it's okay. Carry on. You're doing really well. He says, this is really scary, whatever he was doing. But he carried on talking to his wife, and you could hear her saying, yes, I hear you. And he was sort of talking in whispers to her. And then you can hear her going, oh, like that. And apparently he was cuddling her. There was a description on the website that said he cuddles her or strokes her hair or something. And then you can hear her as the air is literally sucked out of the room as this spirit is dematerialized. Maybe the energy ran out, but you hear the sucking of the air as it gets sucked out of the room, which was, I thought, an interesting thing. I can't say it's absolutely true, but it's very interesting to listen to. But again, he's had accusations of that he's faking it. I mean, he apparently will ask for David Thompson will ask for everyone's name and address and phone number that's going to take part in his seance. He says it's for safety reasons, because he needs to know that he can trust these people not to pull the curtains and things like that. But people who say, oh, well, you're just using that so you can look into us and find us out on Facebook and look into our backgrounds and things like that. So, you know, you've got to kind of say, well, what's right? What's the right procedure? Because we do know in the past that people have been stung by these things where people have pulled the curtains and they've been injured. So you could argue that David Thompson's being sensible. He's taking precautions. He's trying to protect himself and the seance and trying to keep it safe for everybody.
Yes. There would be physicality. I agree with you. There would be contact, because I'm very hard-hearted myself personally. I went to see, fortunately, because I was absolutely against this until I saw a brilliant medium 23 or 24 years ago, and my grandmother came through, and she said when the medium told me she's stroking my hair, I could actually feel someone combing my hair. Now, I had this myself. This was the confirmation I needed. Not just that, the evidence was astronomical. It was amazing. But I could feel physically someone touching and running their hand through my hair. So this is what intrigued me. So there would be physicality through it, like you're saying, like the manifestation of this plasma, this ectoplasm that they bring through, or the voices. Now, Neil, you said about a voice box. Is that like an instrument that the people use when is it like an electronic device, or is it just a simple a box to reverberate the noise in? What is that?
Well, if you imagine that we've all got a little voice box, a larynx or something in us as biological people, we have these. What
Yeah.
happens is that the spirit world, through, say, Leslie Flint, would have manifested or manufactured an imitation voice box, which is rather like a human one. But instead of obviously using human flesh, they would take this ectoplasm and almost like plasticine mold, make a human equivalent of a voice box, but make it out of this ectoplasm material, which would be sustained for the duration of the seance. Now, the accusations that came back was that they said, oh, a lot of these voices sound the same. And they said, the spirit world came back and said, well, the reason they sound the same is that we've only got one voice box to use. Now, obviously, for instance, you're hearing me talk with my voice box, and I hear you guys talking with your voice boxes. Now, we all sound different because we've all got different voice boxes. Whereas in the Leslie Flint seance, for instance, there was only one voice box they would use. So, of course, all these voices, it was claimed, would sound very similar because they're coming through one larynx. And the way I liken that is almost as if, for instance, you've got a person that could do all these wonderful impersonations of different people. But at the end of the day, you can hear a slight intonation within those voices they're doing that it does sound like the person that's behind the voice. So that, Mike Yarwood was the guy that used to do impersonations on TV when I was a kid. And although he did great impersonations, you could always tell it was Mike Yarwood behind it. It's because he had his Mike Yarwood voice box, you see. Yes. And I think it's the same thing with the Leslie Flint voice box that was manifested by the spirits. Had they got the energy to manifest, say, 50 voice boxes of individual spirits within that room for the seance, they would probably all sound different. But remember, they're running on so much energy that they can use, and they're trying to get as many messages out to as many people in a short amount of time. So they have to go with a compromise, I guess.
Yes, it's like having Alexa. To access information, they built one voice for it. So I agree with you. It's like having her. When you want to access information, we have a condition for that for all information. So like the voice box, they had one to access all information from that kind. I hope that's a nice comparison.
Yeah, I mean, I've never used Alexa, but I'd imagine it'd probably annoy me. But yeah, I mean, the technology is moving on now where we are getting things like you've got these ghost boxes, technology that can pick up voices. There's something called Spiricom, which was being developed by this guy called O'Neill in the 1980s, William O'Neill. And he recorded hundreds of hours of EVP, which is electronic voice phenomena. And he actually got in contact with the spirit of a guy called Jeffries Muller, who was a university professor and a NASA scientist who passed away a few years earlier. And yet here he was coming through this Spiricom communication thing, which was rather like, you imagine all the kind of a mad scientist kind of thing. It was a room full of gadgets and everything. And you'd hear this voice coming through. And I've likened it, when you listen to it, it sounds rather like the voices of the Cylon Centurions out of Battlestar Galactica from 1980s TV series. And it's almost as if maybe they kind of use the same kind of technology to produce those voices. But I guess he didn't want to tweak it too much to try and improve it because he could have lost that connection. So I think it was a case of that O'Neill, who was tweaking this machinery, just accepted it, saying, look, you sound like a robot, but I'll accept it because if I tweak it too much, I might lose the signal. But he was in communication with this for quite a while. Yeah,
I mean, I've used Ghostbox. We've had communication through there. Sometimes they've sounded mechanical like a robot. Sometimes we've had kind of like the sound of their voice or the way that they used to speak is coming through their personality, but more times than not, I remembered many years ago where some voices came through a stereo system through the speakers that was unplugged. So I think that those on the other side will try and utilize what form necessary in order to get their message through. So I think it's really fascinating. We're coming to the end of the show because the time goes so quick. But I mean, we just want to thank you, Neil, so much for your interesting research and, of course, your new book that you're working on. And just to remind the listeners that Neil is a brilliant artist and an author. He's been published by one of the largest publishing houses in the world. And also runs his own radio show, Peep Show, but it's linked with the Paranormal UK radio network, and is a constant example, a brilliant example of truth and humility and of research. So your efforts into these cases are astounding, because they were cases that would have been left to be buried, I guess, Neil.
Yes, and also, Neil, before you go, what's your take on poltergeists? Because I actually do believe in them, because our grandfather warned us when we didn't believe any of this when we were kids. We took the mickey out of it. We bought a book about poltergeists, and our grandfather went absolutely ballistic and told us not to deal with them because he said they're real. What's your take on that?
Well, I actually think poltergeist phenomena I've never witnessed it myself, and I've never been there, so I can't speak from experience. But my take on it from a researcher stroke viewer, if you like, of the information that people relayed, is that it sounds very much like, to me, the phenomena that comes through the poltergeist is probably almost like a branch of physical psychic seances that the mediums of like Helen Duncan and Leslie Flint have produced under controlled conditions in a seance room. But this is what I would call, guerrilla psychic warfare, or out in the wilds psychic warfare, because you're getting this phenomenon which is physical as well, but it's not under the control of, say, a medium. I think what's happening is the people that are witnessing it are probably being used as unwilling or unwitting mediums. For instance, the Enfield poltergeist case, which we discussed with Dr. Ian Rubenstein fairly recently for our Paranormal Peep show. That goes out in December 2020. He actually spoke about a researcher whose name escapes me now. He was a physicist, this guy, trained as a physicist, and he actually went to investigate poltergeist activity. I don't know if it's the Enfield one, but he said he was in this particular place where lots of people reported noises and bangs and things like that. The neighbors kept thinking there was arguments going on in the place, apparently, but he said he stayed at the particular place. He had his shirt hanging on a coat hanger on the end of the wardrobe, and he witnessed his shirt on this wardrobe on the hanger being levitated into the air. And as he saw that happening, as a physicist, he said, I had to completely forget all the physics I'd ever been taught when he witnessed that. And so it's something it's beyond our understanding as physicists or as scientists and things like that. We don't understand it, but it doesn't mean to say it's not real.
No, that's right. Because when Philip and I, many years ago, when we saw this medium, we used, I know people would die of shock and horror, an Ouija board. And I wasn't convinced. It was only me and Philip moving the planchette. Now, we had a friend, Susan, with her, who's black and white. She's absolutely wonderful. It was giving us some answers about its name and whatever, and I wasn't convinced, so I wanted proof. So I said to Susan to go out of the room, take a pencil and paper and write something down and stick it in her pocket and come back in. And when she came back, and she'd written something down and popped it in her pocket, and when she came back into the room, I said to the board, now you all tell us what she's written. And it did spell out trickery. So this was a test for me and Philip to confirm we are not in control of this planchette. And I said, no, it's not trickery. If you were in our shoes, you'd do the same. Now, what has she written? And it actually spelt the word out. And Susan went absolutely white. She couldn't believe. She pulled the paper out and showed us both, and it was what she had written down, knowledge of it. So clearly there is an incredible force at work. I mean, I didn't quite like that, actually. I didn't use it after that. I wasn't too comfortable with it. But yes, certainly something very extraordinary. This is why I asked about the poltergeist, because I didn't get a good feeling from this. So as you're saying, multiple levels of this dimension or this contact we have with these people who are deceased. But very interesting. Yes, thank you for that, Neil.
No problem. Well, it's been very enjoyable. Thank you for having me on your show anyway.
And it's been great having you on our show, Neil. And can you tell once again your listeners the name of your book and also how they can contact you or they find out about you?
Yep, sure. Okay, the name of the book currently being written is Encounters with Fairies, Ghosts and Spirits by Neil Geddes-Ward. If anyone wants to email me, if they've got any fantastic stories they want to share, whether fairies, spirits, ghosts or anything strange or weird, because although I talk about the strange and weird spirits and ghosts, I actually go into a section towards the end of the book where there's things that we don't even label as spirits or ghosts, and that's twig people following up the garden path, twig people, and people sitting on, 50-foot giants sitting on churches. I've got stories like that in there, which you obviously know about anyway, Philip and Ronnie. Yes. So yeah, they can contact me at Neil. That's Neil, Neil at Geddes-Ward, and I'll spell that for you. It's GEDDESWARD.co.uk, Neil at Geddes-Ward.co.uk. They can keep up with me and my colleague Andy Chaplin on the Paranormal Peep Show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, which you can find us on that on Spreaker, I understand, but we also have a YouTube channel for that as well. And I'm also on Facebook, but if anyone wants to friend me on Facebook, it's handy if you can drop me a little message to sort of introduce yourself first, because otherwise I get so many requests. I don't know if they're fake profiles or whatever. And at least if they said, oh, I heard you on such and such a show, at least I know who you are, type of thing.
Yeah, that is brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Neil, and we wish you great success, not only with your book, but also the continuation of your dedicated research into the paranormal and your brilliant art, by the way. I have to thank you so much for your help in all areas. In all areas of both me and Ronnie. We just, we get hold of Neil, and Neil tries to sort it all out for us.
Brilliant artist, Neil. Your artwork is phenomenal, absolutely amazing. And for our listeners, you really do need to see Neil's work. It's incredible work.
So thank you, Neil. Thank you very much. And it remains for me to say that your guest tonight is the esteemed Neil Geddes-Ward, artist, author, radio host, and also paranormal investigator, UFO investigator as well. And you've been listening to Twin Souls Radio, brought to you in association with the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Stay safe and watch the skies.